Okay, sorry. Well, I think we are live on everything but LinkedIn, which is fine. We're just going to remove LinkedIn from this stream. Okay, all right. Weird. We had an error with LinkedIn. No worries. Hey, welcome everybody. My name's Cameron. I am the content lead at Tinybird, and I'm very, very excited today because I've got Steven Tey with me. A lot of y'all, actually, most of y'all are probably here for Steven and not for me, or Tinybird for that matter. But I bet if you don't know Steven, I'm sure you have just heard of what he is doing over at Dub. If you know him from his For Sale days, but um, Dub is Steven, I'll allow you introduce yourself and explain Dub.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm sure there are a bunch of people here for you too. I was just telling you, Cameron, right before the show, how much I have been a big fan of his content since the early days of Tiny Bird. And yeah, I'm very excited to be here. It's a pleasure. So what Dub is the simple way of explaining is it's basically an open source link management platform. We started out as an open source alternative to Bitly, but obviously, we've grown so much beyond just what Bitly does. We have a lot of extra features, and we're moving towards a direction where it's no longer going to be just link shortening, but we're actually the sort of grand vision that we have is we're turning links from being a simple resource locator, URLs, to a full end-to-end attribution engine. So understanding what happens after a click, does the user actually sign up for an account? Do they actually upgrade to a subscription? Painting the entire picture. That's sort of like what we're trying to build. It's a full analytics engine, and couldn't have done it without Tinybird. So
Well,
very
that's
excited
awesome.
to hear more about what happens behind the scenes and
Yeah.
a little
Well,
nerdy.
as a marketer and as a Dub user, I'm very excited about that vision. That's really cool. So let me just before we kind of launch in, first of all, welcome everybody. If you have questions, feel free to ask them. If you're watching on YouTube, you can ask them in the YouTube chat. They'll show up here. Ask them as they come. You know, this session is for you. It's for the people who have joined and are here and want to learn. So we're not gonna do a ton of like live coding. This is more of a discussion. I think Steven will share some things from the Dub project as it kind of relates to what we're talking about. But yeah, if you have questions, ask them. I will also send a follow-up email that has the recording, so you can watch that on your own time. I'll link to the Dub repo because I think if you're here, you're probably interested in that and seeing what Steven is showing off. And then any other resources, like if we mention some things during this call, I'll be happy to share them. But before we dig into the meat of this, the whole thing we're talking about today is user-facing analytics, and the idea being, um, you know, being able to put data analytics in front of your users and have it be really, really performant. And I just want to share. I'm going to do this. I'm going to share a slide. I'm very sorry. It's only one, I promise. But just to kind of like set the stage for what, at least at Tinybird, what we mean by user-facing analytics. And we kind of have these like 5 tenets of real-time analytics and by extension user-facing analytics, which is, if you think about, let me start at the top, which is if you think about, your application, an application that you're building, and you want to embed analytics into that application, there's user experience is at stake. All right, so it's about how do you put those analytics in front of your users in a way that is going to deliver a really, really great analytics experience. And I know, like I've mentioned this on prior live streams, I've used so many products that have like embedded BI dashboards. I've built products that have embedded BI dashboards in my career, and they suck. They're really bad. They're really slow. They're really non-performant. The styles don't match. It's bad. And so when we talk about user-facing analytics, we talk about data that's fresh. So we're going to show that with Dub, which is pretty cool. Data that's like seconds old. Queries to the analytics database that respond in milliseconds. The ability to support highly concurrent queries. This isn't business intelligence. This is putting analytics in the app. So we're going to have, if you scaling like Dub is scaling, you're going to have a lot of users hitting that database at any given time. So concurrency is really important there. And then query complexity. I mean, anytime you're talking about analytics, we're talking about generally a high level of complexity on queries. This is not transactions. This is analytics, a little bit different. And then historical data. One of the things that's great about Dub is like you can go and look at your link clicks since you started the project. And so that's a lot of data to retain and still be able to surface to the user really quickly. And so, Steven, anything you would add to that?
No, I think you hit on all the points that I had in mind. And in fact, I actually have the perfect example that I can share in a bit that touches on each of these points you mentioned here. So very excited.
Wonderful. Before we do that, I just want to show it, like, because I think, first of all, it's well known. Dub is a Tinybird customer. Tinybird is a Dub customer. It's a great little party. But I'm actually going to show. I mean, we're going to have some fun here and actually show what this looks like. This is Tinybird's Dub. This is where I literally have a Dub tab open in my browser all the time.
You gotta set a logo for that uses Tinybird.
Oh yeah. Oh goodness, man. I'm just building stuff. I don't have time. But I'm gonna create a link. So we have this Dub customer story on our website, and I'm gonna create a short link to this, which in Dub is super easy. I will call this Dub story. Hey, we'll put a UTM in here, and I'll just say we're gonna set YouTube as our source, and then I will just call this, webinar. I like to use the UTM codes a lot. So social media cards is awesome. There's all kinds of great. I mean, you keep adding stuff, dude. Like every time I go to this list, there's another feature. This is awesome. And so I'm going to create this link. And now I would encourage anybody to, go to this link, tbird.co/dub story. I'll post it in the comments, and you can just click that.
I just did.
You just clicked it. Okay, great. Let me post it in the comments. But I'm just going to open this up in Dub, the analytics for this link. Boom, there's Steven's click. And so I just this is one of the things that makes a Dub so amazing for me as a user, as a Dub user, is that I can get these real-time analytics. Like I know where Steven is. Sorry, I'm doxing you. I know where you are. I know the device you're on.
I'm using VPN, so all good.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. But as people click on this, we're starting to get all of this real-time data, that this is happening, in real time. And you've used some cool React hooks that I think you can probably explain here, that if I click away and I come back, let me, well, now I'm just looking at that whole one. Yeah, let me go that one. But I love this.
Got a party in here.
Yeah. 9 clicks. All right. Well, cool. Well, let me pull this off the screen and just kind of let's go back to Dub here. Let's talk about just kind of what user-facing analytics looks like at Dub. And so one of the things I will ask, if you don't mind sharing, Steven, just because I think scale is going to be a really important part of this conversation.
Yep.
If you don't mind sharing, I think last time you and I chatted in the video that we did, you were at 5 million link clicks a month, but growing at an insane rate. Where are you at right now with scale?
I can
and
show
maybe
that.
What's your vision for scale?
Yes, that's a fantastic question. I can actually show it without revealing any customer data. Yep, let me just zoom that out and share my screen. How do I do this? Okay, share screen.
Yeah, I'll add it.
Share screen. Can you see my screen here?
Yep. There we go.
So we are at, this is the last 24 hours, but if you look at the last 30 days, we're at 6 million. 6.6 million. So it's growing really rapidly. And we are expecting to hit, we're growing at about 30 to 50% month-over-month rate. And considering the features that we're adding in the coming months and the sort of focus on programmatic usage, we're confident that this is going to get to the 100 million range within the next 12 months. And I'm really glad that we chose Tinybird since day one, because I mean, actually not since day one. I can tell a bit about the story there, but I'm really glad we're using Tinybird, because cannot imagine having to deal with hundreds of millions of ingested rows, and sort of aggregating and visualizing the data and sub 200 millisecond latency. So yeah, that's basically where we're at.
Awesome. Yeah, and I want to be clear. Like, I don't want this session to be like a Tinybird customer story. We already have that. We don't need to rehash that. Obviously, Tinybird is an important part of the user facing analytics experience. That's why we're here. But I don't want this to become a Tinybird love sesh. But I will say, I will ask, as can you first maybe just talk us through like what your tech stack does look like for user facing analytics? Maybe you can talk more broadly about how you're building Dub, but with a focus on the user facing analytics side.
Sure, sure. So Dub, to give some context, Dub started as an open source side project of mine. When I was working at Vercel, it basically started as a weekend project, and it grew into a full blown business, which is really surreal to me as I think about it now. But in the beginning, we started with it was an Next.js full stack application. We used Edge middleware, which is a Next.js / Vercel feature to process all the redirects, and for retrieving data and storing them caching, we used Redis. And in the beginning, we actually used Redis sorted sets to handle time series analytics. And it worked to an extent until one of the links that were added hit like 50,000 clicks. And we were like, oh, the page takes about 3 to 4 seconds to load. That's not very ideal. And that's when I started researching my options, and Tinybird came up as the natural alternative, because we were already using it at Vercel to power Vercel Analytics. And I was familiar with SQL. So ClickHouse SQL, Tinybirds, the way you use Tinybird is very, very relevant if you already know SQL. So that's why I chose Tinybird. And it's been growing since. We've added a bunch of new dependencies, but we try to be as very conscientious when adding new dependencies because of our open source nature. And it's important that the dependencies we add are open source friendly as well. So for the main database, we use MySQL, and there's a few more like smaller libraries that I can mention, but those are the general ones. And obviously it's deployed on Vercel, and I should cover it.
Right on. Yeah. Pretty simple. I like it. Very builder oriented, which is great. Okay, so let's talk about how the user facing analytics kind of
Yep.
the process of building that at Dub. And we think about user facing analytics. There's kind of 3 steps. We have actually capturing that data, so instrumenting your product or instrumenting these link clicks such that you're capturing those clicks, you're capturing those events. And then you have kind of the data processing, how you're analyzing, querying, building those metrics, and then obviously how you then integrate it into your application, how you visualize it. So maybe let's just start on like the ingestion side. It's kind of the beginning of that story. When somebody clicks a Dub link, what happens? How does that data kind of make it? Where does that data start flowing into your analytics system?
I can share my screen and walk through the code if that helps.
Awesome. Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay.
And by the way, Steven, you can just keep sharing your screen, and I'll just add it and remove it from the stage so that people can see it and not see it. But
sounds good. Yeah. Great. So everything starts from a link click at Dub. So when you click on a Dub part link, we use, as I mentioned earlier, Edge middleware. It's a very nifty primitive that allows you to process and return a response, and then keep processing after the response has been returned, which is fantastic for storing analytics in this case. So as you can see here, when someone clicks on a link, we basically fetch the link from Redis. It's a pretty long process. I'm not gonna go too deep into the weeds, but basically we do a hedge get, which is using a Redis hash. And then once we get the destination URL, we basically return that to the user. And we also call this function called event wait until, and that's basically a way for you to do any asynchronous processes after the response has been returned, which is great because you don't block the main thread and the user gets the redirect right away. So within the record click function, as you can see, it basically processes the data and then it makes a call to Tinybird's events endpoint. And that basically allows you to, the cool thing about Tinybird's events endpoint is it's really powerful. You can ingest upwards of thousands of clicks per second, which we are slowly but steadily, actually not very slowly, we're
Yeah,
getting there.
rapidly.
So yeah, we basically store a bunch of different data points like country, region, latitude, device type, the user agent, etc. For GDPR purposes, we also do not store the IP address if you're from a European country. It's just a small little detail. But it's very interesting because these are basically immutable. I learned this the hard way, actually. When I started, I didn't know that you need to separate immutable data versus mutable ones. But shout out to Dan Chafelson from Tinybird who taught me this.
He's
But
the man.
basically, yeah, Dan's the man indeed. But basically, the way we do it is we basically store immutable data, which is click events. And that means that includes the, like I said earlier, country, geolocation data, device data, as well as the link ID. And the link ID will never change, right? It's an immutable, unique value. We store it in one data source. This is a data source. It looks scary, but it's not that complex. It's basically just different columns for different values that we're storing. And then we store every time someone creates a link or edits a link or transfers a link from one workspace to another, we store that information in a separate table. These are mutable data points. And that we basically, the data is being stored as link ID, domain, key, URL, and the project ID. So, and what we do is basically we join the two tables using the link ID field. So you see link IDs in both tables. We basically join them, which gives you a complete picture that allows you to do something like this, where you can see an overview. So this is actually a really cool project. I'll talk more about that later. But what that join does, it basically allows you to get an overview of the top performing links in a given workspace. And you can also see the country and city breakdown. Look how fast that was. I clicked on the tab, it loaded in less than like 200 to 300 milliseconds. But going back to the point, yeah, so joining those tables allows you to like be very flexible with the data you're storing and mute. And the thing about ClickHouse SQL is that it's not like a regular relational database like Postgres or MySQL where you can go in there and update rows in the database. But with ClickHouse, it's a little different because it's an OLAP database, which means I forgot the full term. Shame on me.
Online analytical processing. Yeah.
Exactly. So
I write content about it all the time. I've memorized that one. Yeah.
Subject matter expertise. That's awesome. But basically, it's basically a database that it's great for storing time series data. And as a result, the trade-off there is you cannot easily update data. And because of that, that's why you need to have two separate tables or data sources, one for immutable data and one for mutable. And then you do a join to sort of like aggregate and display the data in a dashboard like this. For what it's worth, all our code is open source, so you can check it out on GitHub. I'm not gonna bore you guys with the nitty-gritty, but that's the sort of high-level overview that I wish someone would have told me before I built something like this. I learned, as I said, the hard way, but incredibly rewarding once I figured it out with the help of Dan. So going back to what this is, I can just, if you don't mind, I can share a little bit more about this project.
No, please. Yeah, go for it.
So yesterday we launched a cool open source template called OSS Gallery. It's basically a crowdsourced list of all the best open source projects on the web. You can see it's sort of like a star count right now because I couldn't think of a better metric. I was rushing the deadline. Obviously, we'll add a few like categories and sorting filters later on. But the cool thing about this is it's actually built on Dub's API, which is built on Tinybird's API. So it's kind of like a meta thing if you think about it. And what I mean by that is if I go to my profile, look at Dub, you can see these are real-time link clicks that happen when someone clicks on the link in the title. So for example, I clicked on website, go in and refresh that. Oops, awkward. Oops. Oh, here we
There it
go.
is. That
Took a
was
second.
seconds, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Still pretty
Network
good.
latency, right?
Exactly. And it's doing two hops because it's going through dub and then the dub pings Tinybird. So it's like a two hop situation. And what I mean by this is it's basically a template that shows off how you can use dub's API to build something like, I don't know, product hunt or something like beta list or any website that could act as like a referral source, like a software review site. We actually have one of my friends who runs efficient.app, and they basically do software reviews, and they also basically are affiliates for all these companies that they do reviews for. And therefore, something like this template basically shows you how you can programmatically create links and uh, as because you're using Dops API, you get automatic world-class analytics that you can easily ping and retrieve using our API. I'm going to walk you through really quickly because I want to focus more on the ClickHouse and Tinybird side of things. But basically, what our API allows you to do is you can get analytics for different endpoints like time series, which is actually what we're using right here. You basically ping one of our endpoints, and it returns to you the clicks and the exact information that you need to build a chart like this. For what it's worth, I built this project in like 2 days, and it was really easy because we used charting libraries. This one is called Tremor, as well as Dub's API. So and going back to Dub, right? See here you can see these are all the different clicks for the links that people have added to OSS Gallery. And you can see that some of the really cool ones like Roadmap or Plane, these are like the top projects by clicks. And but under the hood, this is all using Tinybird, and we're exposing it via an API client to whoever wants to build on top of our API, create links, edit them programmatically, and get world-class analytics that you can display to your user. This is a very unique use case. I don't think any like incumbents like Bitly or Short.io or any of these tools have really nailed down the aspect of having a link management solution that is fantastic for developers to integrate into their own platforms. And we've actually been seeing some really success cases, like, for example, Raycast, they actually use Dub to integrate link sharing into their products like Ray.so. And there's also companies like Midday. I'm just trying to find that. They also use Dub programmatically, and they display the analytics directly to their users too using our API. So it's really, really cool use case. And all this couldn't have been done without Tinybird's amazing analytics engine. And I think I hope I touched on all the different points that were mentioned earlier. Um, Real time, powerful aggregation. There were 5 points. But yeah.
Historical data being well, and it was funny because I was thinking as you were actually showing like the you know I mean I can show like what I was talking about with this is like when you do these filters, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I mean, okay, so we don't have a lot of clicks on this dub story, right? The one that I shared. But like this is every time I change one of these filters, right? We're not hitting a cache. We're like going to the database.
Yep.
And I think that's always a really important point is, this is not this is not in memory. This is like we're going to disk, like we're getting this data, and it's happening really quickly. And why are we doing that? Because data is being written all the time, and the goal is to always incorporate that data as it's being written, and that's a really kind of important, fundamental for user facing analytics, at least as the way
Yes.
that we think about it.
100%. I think we've sort of like this is like transitioning from older software, like a legacy analytics players. Like there's Google's Looker Studio, I don't know, Metabase, and all these different like larger scale analytics platforms. They're powerful, but at the same time, they don't really focus on the real time aspect. And I've used Bitly in the past. I've used different link solution platforms, And it's really hard to tell, oh, are people actually, clicking on my link right now? I just shared it, tweeted it out. So real time definitely plays a huge factor in that, not just a wow factor, but also providing valuable data to the marketer. And at the same time, it's also very interesting that the reason I brought up Lucas Studio is because people are actually, like, some of our customers are converting from Lucas Studio over to Dub because they have a very niche use case, which is they want to offer short links, but also at the same time, they want to offer analytics to their users. And there's not one platform out there that does both. There are obviously, like, people have used Lucas Studio in the past, but it's incredibly expensive and very, not very flexible to use. What we provide with the help of Tinybird is something that's very easy to integrate, cost efficient, and has real-time data. So I think that's sort of what makes us stand out, and why I'm really excited to continue growing and scaling our solution and API on top of Tinybird.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as a customer, as a marketer who uses
Yep.
like we use Google Analytics at Tinybird. We also use Tinybird at Tinybird. We actually have a lot of different analytics tools, but like, you know, Dub, we don't do short links for everything, but basically it's like anytime we link to our domain from an external domain, we use a short link, and we use Dub for that. And like the analytics experience in Dub versus in Google Analytics, like it's, I mean, it's like night and day. I mean, like people who have used Google, marketers who have used, especially GA4, like
Mm.
it's really frustrating. It's a really frustrating tool, and it's slow. But
Cool.
I think it's worth, like, it's a really important point of emphasis. Like, there's a user experience component here that me as a user, I really love jumping into Dub to look at the analytics for my clicks because it's fast and it's performant. And I mean, even just simple things like, you're writing you're building a Next.js app. You have these, React components, you have these chart components that you're able to define these global styles, right?
Mhm.
And because Tinybird is presenting the data to you as, a JSON response to an HTTP request, it's
Mhm.
like integrating that into your existing styles, into your existing application.
Yep.
It's much easier, right? It's
Oh
not,
yeah.
you're not embedding an iframe, right?
Oh
And then
yeah.
having to go and have a whole different set of styles that you manage in some other tool.
Yeah,
Um,
JSON is. I feel like there's. I think I saw this tweet from Chad Cian, who's like a famous
uh-huh, uh-huh.
creator at UI library. It's like it says like my love language is literally pinging an API that returns a JSON endpoint, and you'd be surprised how many APIs that are like from legacy platforms that don't do that. They return
Yeah.
some weird response, I don't know, XML or like SOAP. I don't know. It's like just terrible. And that's what I love about Tiny Birds, because it's the sort of developer experience and the ease of being able to just ingest data points and then return. And the fact that you can create API endpoints from SQL. I don't think I've ever used any platform that does that. So that's really great for people that are not very good at architecting like a full, I don't know, in like a web infrastructure, but knows SQL really well and knows REST APIs really well. If you know these two, that's all you need to know to use Tinybird, and that's sort of where I landed. So yeah, that's another point I wanted to mention.
Yeah, that is an interesting point that you do bring up about. I know I promised this wouldn't become a Tiny Bird love fest, but like, but because you're kind of like a full stack dev with a focus on the web dev side. Maybe I don't know if that's fair. I don't want to put you in a box, but you're able to use Tiny Bird really effectively because you know SQL.
Yep.
But I would, I wouldn't say that SQL is like your main, that's not your main skill, right? Like, but the flip side is that like Tinybird is also really popular amongst data engineers who are
Mm.
really powerful in the SQL space,
Yep.
because then it's like, okay, well, like an example customer of ours that we've talked a lot about is FanDuel, who's really focused on like self-serve, is creating these, being able to empower their team, the data engineering and the data platform team being able to empower their team to build things. It's like, okay, I can build these data products, and then it's just an API, and then it's
Mm.
just a JSON endpoint, which I can hand off to any engineering team and say, okay, here's your, you know here's your, here's your data product, basically. Like you
Right.
can integrate this really easily.
Right.
Okay. I want to talk about, I think there are
Real quick,
some, yeah,
before
go
we
for it.
segue, I wanted to mention. So I want to be also unbiased. I want to also mention some sort of room for improvement in the TinyBird API. And I think one idea it's actually really cool is my friend. I'm sharing my screen real quick. So a friend of mine, Andreas, he built a TinyBird SDK. Basically, it's a
Uh-huh.
full type safe SDK that allows you to integrate with Zod and query TinyBird endpoints in a type safe manner. And I think this is a really cool project. I've tried it out in the past, and they actually use it in production for his company.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
it basically,
Check it
and
out.
yeah, it
Haven't got my
enhances
MP. Yeah.
it enhances the TinyBird API. If this is great for people who use TypeScript and Node.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using, I don't know, something else like PHP, it might be a little bit different. But I think this is a really great. I think one thing that TinyBird could potentially do is work with folks like Speakeasy. They basically turn your REST API or open API spec into a full. You can generate like TypeScript SDKs, Python, Go, Java, and it's really like affordable for enterprises. It's like literally $250 per month per SDK.
Huh.
And we
Oh,
actually have been
interesting.
using that for our SDK too. But
Oh,
yeah, I
nice.
just want to mention this really cool project by Andreas and how it's enhances the developer experience for TinyBird.
Yeah, he's gonna. I was actually slacking him earlier
Oh,
because I
nice.
told him I was gonna wear this, and he's like, "Oh, somebody booked a meeting, so I won't be able
Oh,
to be there."
that's what he
Uh,
was telling me about. I was like, enjoy the hoodie. I'm like, okay, is the camera wearing another? I don't know. I don't know what he was
yeah,
talking,
yeah.
but it makes so much
Yeah,
more sense.
he hooked me up.
That's
Okay,
awesome.
I
I need
want to
one.
talk about yeah. Um, I need one of those dub Nike hats. That's what I need.
Ooh,
Um,
get that
uh,
symbol.
but I want to talk about it, like some of these aspects of user-facing analytics. Um, I mean, there are a lot of details. And by the way, folks, like if you have questions, ask them. We'll answer them right now. Like if you have questions about how Steven is building Dub or some of the things he's doing, but one of the things maybe as a discussion starter is multi-tenancy becomes a really important point when you're. Oh, actually, we have a question. This well, let's come back to the multi-tenancy. Let's answer. We got Cameron's question here. Let me show this, which is basically how about using it? It, I guess, meaning Tinybird. Why would I not want to use it for simple activity feed generation? Um,
You
yeah, I
could.
mean, yeah,
I
you
mean,
totally could. And actually, I mean, there's tons of use cases for Tinybird. User facing analytics tends to be one of the most common that people start with because I think there's a big push right now for a lot of, especially SaaS, to
mhm.
implement analytics in their product. Um, but there's tons of stuff that people build with Tinybird. Personalization is another big one where you're actually using, in session events, like you have a user on your website and they're sending signals about the way that they're browsing. And you can actually enrich that with historical data
Mhm.
and, personalizing
Yeah,
the browsing experience. So,
yeah. So, it's a really good question because I think the way I would distinguish between if you should use ClickHouse or TinyBird versus a traditional like MySQL Postgres is ask yourself, do you want to update this data a lot? Is it very relational? Like, do you need to do like relationships between a user, a post, and comments? In that case, it makes sense to use a more traditional like MySQL or Postgres. Uh, but when it comes to analytics, that's when sort of um, Tinybird and ClickHouse shines. And in this case, you could potentially use both. So you could store the actual like content that the metadata that the users are generating in the activity feed in MySQL Postgres. And then with Tinybird, what you would do is store the insights like, oh, this user posted, I don't know, like you can just store them as rows to be able to visualize activity over time, which is what you mentioned in the colons there. Yeah, brackets there. So
right.
yeah, it's possible to use both side by side simultaneously. And I also wanted to touch on like I think I glanced over it earlier about immutable versus mutable data. And the thing about TinyBird and ClickHouse as a whole is when storing mutable data, the way, instead of like going back in and updating a row, what you would do is you would ingest a newer version of the row of the data. Like for example, you have, I don't know, a post or a comment. Every time someone makes a change, edits it or deletes it, you basically ingest a new row. And Tinybird has this thing called replacing merge tree. It's basically a mechanism for you to deduplicate rows that have the same ID and then get the latest version. And that basically allows you to build some sort of like a CRUD model where you can update data, but you're technically not. You're just storing
Right.
like an activity log in a
Right.
way. So that's sort of like the sort of understanding that you need to be able to decide between, oh, should I be using Tinybird or should I be using Postgres or MySQL or both?
Yeah, and often for SaaS builders, it's both. It totally makes sense for it to be both. We have another question from Kevin, which I think is a really good question.
Ooh, love
Um,
that.
and I actually like this is a really good. We've actually talked about this pattern. We actually just recently published a blog post about and I can share it in the follow up. But we just recently did a project where we migrated the schema of one of our biggest internal tables. So we use Tinybird internally for some things.
Mhm.
And one of the things we use it for is this thing we have called service data sources, which is um, it's basically like data sources that you can query in Tinybird that will tell you things like stats metadata about your Tinybird workspace.
Mhm.
And so we actually had to change some. We had to add a column, right? Which is not relatively, it's not that problematic. But you can run into a lot of problems when you're streaming data and you're trying to do sort of these migrations. But there's an
Uh-huh.
important pattern here that I think, Kevin, for you makes a lot of sense, where you're saying my users can send, completely custom metadata. What we recommend in that case in Tinybird is that you actually just ingest like so for instance maybe that metadata stored as or structured as JSON, like you can just put an entire JSON string into a single column
Yep,
in
I'm sure.
the
An
in the
example
data
right
source.
now.
Oh, okay, yeah, let me add this is great. um,
It's the official web analytics starter kit from Tinybird.
yes, I was
That's
working on this yesterday. It's perfect. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've been referring to this a lot. It's very interesting the way it's structured. So it touches on your point exactly, Kevin, is that you basically store a JSON payload as a JSON, column type, and then within the pipe, what you would do is basically you would, I believe that you first create a materialized view, and then you would do like a select JSON extract string that allows you to extract whatever fields in the JSON that's present in the JSON object, locale, location, whatever. So it basically allows very like a very flexible way of data storage and retrieval, and that's something that we're actually thinking about as well because, as I mentioned earlier, we're adding a new product to basically allow you to track conversions, and users might have their own event types. They might want to say, oh, this is signing up for an account, this is clicking on the checkout button. Like there are so many different permutations that we cannot foresee before time. So storing it at JSON makes a lot of sense. And what Tinybird and ClickHouse allows you to do is that you basically just go in there afterwards and then just create a JSON extract string, a way of aggregating data and display back to the user. So it's definitely very flexible, and there's a lot of ways that you can go about tackling this problem.
Yeah, and I think it's because the kind of going back to that project that we were doing on the way that we iterated that data source is like we're streaming probably hundreds of thousands of events to this data source at least every day, if not every hour. Um, and the nice thing about having that sort of unstructured column is that as that as the events change upstream, whatever's emitting the events, maybe they change that payload, like we don't have to worry that late data can still land in that data source. It still matches the schema as we're iterating and as we're changing. So that becomes really important too, being able to store that unstructured data so that as you migrate and as you change, you can continue to update that. And with Tinybird, you would use something like a materialized view to then kind of parse and store that data into this new data source that incrementally updates as new data arrives. Um,
Yep.
okay. let's these were good questions. I'm glad they came up, and I do think it's important. Like multi-tenancy becomes a, I think a really interesting issue as you're capturing all of this data, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand like Dub, you have an events data source, and
Yep.
that's pooling, all those 6.6 million link clicks for all your users for every tenant.
Yep.
Can you just talk through like maybe how do you handle multi-tenancy user access? So if I go to my Dub dashboard and I'm looking at analytics, I'm only seeing, TinyBird's data. How do you handle that?
That's a great question. So the way we do it, I'm going to share my screen again. But
Yep.
the way we do it, it's basically use like so within we have an analytics helper here that basically paints Tinybird and retrieves data for a given workspace. So we basically you might see there's a discrepancy here, workspace ID, project ID, and that's mostly because we did a migration recently. We converted the names, so just ignore that. But basically, this is the main this is the main differentiator between different workspaces. So it's literally just a query parameter that you pass into your Tinybird pipes. So for instance, I can show you one of them, which is, sorry, endpoints. One of them is country, right, for example. So in this massive SQL query, actually not that big,
Oh, that's not
uh,
that big.
exactly. So all you do is basically within here, we have a pre-where function by the way, this is something that we probably will want to optimize in the future too, because it's processing a bit, quite a bit of data, but I think there's definitely room for improvement. So just take it with a grain of salt. But basically, what we do is we filter links. As I mentioned earlier, we have this links metadata, which is the mutable data source. We filter the links by the project ID that's passed, and then we return data for that. And to secure it on another, like on the application level, we also use obviously like an authentication um, wrapper or HOC that basically looks at the user's API key and makes sure that they are part of the workspace and are able to retrieve the analytics that are related to that workspace. So it's like a multi-layer authentication slash filtering mechanism here. And we also have like a check for if the user is exceeding their monthly clicks quota, and then we return like a 403 request status code that sort of prompts them to upgrade. So there are like different parts of the code that secures this, but when it comes down to the Tinybird query URL that we construct here, it's literally just a query parameter. So it's very
Gotcha. Okay.
simple, and the Tinybird pipes feature sort of handles all the conversion into SQL and returning the data. So yeah.
That's interesting. I'm curious, because one of the things that I've shared in past sessions is, when you create those, when you turn a pipe, we call it a pipe. What's a pipe in Tinybird? It's just a set of SQL nodes that you can just basically build kind of a super query. But when you turn that into an API, you can generate then like auth tokens that have read scope for that pipe. And then one of the nice things about Tinybird is you can implement row level security. So like a common pattern that I've seen other people do is, when let's say somebody gets, a dub authorization, that you would also generate a Tinybird API key for them, or a Tinybird auth token when they sign up. So now that they have a Tinybird token that would only give them access to the Tinybird pipe. So you can handle it in that sense, or you can pass it as a query parameter. I'm kind of curious, was it just a simplicity decision for why you did that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we went with just one admin token for obviously it's secured, and then we're making sure to rotate that every couple of months. But just one token for all the pipes made a lot of sense because we just needed a way to ping a JSON, like a REST API, and get back JSON. And we prefer to handle the sort of authentication for the multi-tenancy in the application level.
Yeah.
But yeah, I gotta look into this role level security thing. Looks very interesting. Maybe you could
We've
we
got
could adopt that in the future.
yeah, we've got a couple of blog posts on it, kind of like there's a blog post we have about multi-tenancy and Tinybird, and the ways that there's several ways you can sort of handle it.
Mhm.
And row level security is one of them.
Right.
Um, And the nice thing about it is like you can actually give row level security to the data source. So say any
Oh,
pipe you build, you can have one token. You don't have to add all these pipes to the read scope, right? You can just put the scope on the data source, and it'll only pull in that data from that belongs to maybe a tenant ID
and
or something like that.
does that support like, I don't know, upwards of tens of thousands of tenants, or is it unlimited? Like what's
Theoretically, I actually don't know. There might be some soft limit on the number of tokens you can create. Um, that's not I don't know that answer, but yeah, we can I don't know. We'll figure that out.
nice?
A couple of questions. Somebody asked, were you using TinyBird at the beginning, or you made it clear that you needed to move that? I think you already answered that. So
Mhm.
Tone Row, thanks for your question. You you can either watch the recording we talked about it in the beginning, or if you check
I
out
can
the
give it
TinyBird.
TLDR. I can give
Yeah,
it TLDR.
yeah, give it TLDR. Go for it.
We started with Redis sorted sets for the time series analytics, and then we got to a scale where one of the links had like 50,000 clicks, and because of that, like the dashboard was taking 5 seconds to load, and we decided to eventually move towards Tinybird because of it's just built different, and it's perfect for time series analytics. TLDR.
TLDR, like it. Another question from Alex is, how do you how do you plan to scale Dub? Basically, you've got it as a mono repo. Are you going to break it up into microservices, or how do you think about that?
Great question. I think we're going to stick to monorepo for the foreseeable future, simply because we're using this tool called Turbo Repo, and it's really performant when it comes to monorepo management, and it allows you to basically break out all your like. We're actually not fully utilizing it. We only use it mainly to um, so the way we have it is we have our production application in a monorepo. We also break out the UI components that we call it dub/UI, and as well as like utility functions into separate packages that we also consume in our private marketing side application. So that it's a separate repo. It's private. We actually it was public before we had to take it private because there were too many people just cloning it and copying it. So the main sort of like the main application is still open source, and that's where all the tiny bit magic happens. So going back to the question of monorepo, I think we're probably going to stick to that for the foreseeable future, and also fully utilize it in such a way that we break out the different like analytics and Tinybird helper functions into their own packages, and that's really cool because it allows you to just reuse it between different applications that you have within your monorepo. Like for example, we're going to build like an admin panel. We're building like a storybook to understand like our design system and stuff like that. So that monorepo structure really allows you to do that, and it also allows you to publish new packages to npm using tsub. That's what we use, TSUP. So yeah, that's basically our plan.
Cool. Might have some more questions filter in, but I think one of the things that I'm not going to call it an elephant in the room. It's not, but it's an important question, which is I kind of like when I was showing the Dub analytics experience, and it's like, yeah, we're not caching, we're going straight to the database, we're running this, we're running this query every time.
Mm,
There's sort of like this little, red alert light that's like expensive, expensive, expensive. Like it feels like how, come on, that sounds like not the optimal way to do it. So I'm
mm.
just, spoiler alert, it is, and it can be optimized. But I would just turn
Yep.
it to you and ask, like, um, what are maybe some of the levers that you have pulled as Dub has scaled to
Mhm.
keep costs in check, and maybe specifically focused on the analytics experience?
That's a great question. I think one of the things I mentioned before, I don't think it was in this call, is that analytics is the bread and butter of Dub. Like we want to be building analytics that people are willing to pay for, and as a result of that, we would basically have a limit on the number of clicks that we show to you every single month. So, for example, on the free plan, you get up to 1,000 clicks per month, which is quite sufficient if for example, you're just creating links recreationally and you don't get too many clicks. And then when you exceed that limit, you'll be prompted to upgrade to Pro. And the cool thing about Tinybird is it basically allows us to keep storing all the data because storage is cheap. It is the sort of retrieval of data that's more expensive. So what we do is we track and make sure that the user is if they exceed the limit, we basically just say, oh, we don't return the data, both from the dashboard and the API, and they're prompted to upgrade to the next tier. On Pro, you get 50,000 clicks per month, and then on Business, you get 150,000, and so on and so forth. We actually looking into a different pricing model pretty soon, which is might be a little bit of spoilers. It's not set in stone yet, so don't quote me on that. But we're thinking of moving towards usage-based pricing, which is what Tinybird is already doing, and I think it makes a lot of sense for, especially as we move towards more of like an analytics engine product, as opposed to a simple like SaaS, like Bitly or like all these different link shortening tools before. So we're basically allowing customers to be billed on not micro units, but billed per unit. So you're billed per click instead of having to like pay for 150,000 clicks and then maybe you just use
Right.
70,000. So you get, for a lot of customers, it's actually going to be cheaper. And at the same time, it's like you basically can scale to infinity. You don't need to like, oh, I hit the limit, I gotta upgrade now. It's more of like a you pay as you go model. So that's sort of like what we're thinking. But yeah, going back to the question is, we basically gate the number of like clicks that you can retrieve every single month to keep our costs in check.
Are there things that you're doing like on the actual query side where you're,
Oh,
like you mentioned working with Dan, right? Like helping you figure
yeah.
out some of these things, a way to optimize.
Yeah,
That's something we do often with customers. It's
yeah,
kind of like,
100%. That's something that we actually are trying to improve. It's not, I would say it's not ideal. Like if you remember, I mentioned earlier about going to like this model where it's like immutable and then mutable data in different tables, and then you join them. So before that, we were actually doing all in one table. It was actually way more performant, but less flexible. Like you cannot change your domain for the link. I mean, you could change it, but it breaks the analytics, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. So we needed a more flexible approach, and therefore we moved towards this two table structure. And because of that, like the process data went up a little bit. And actually not a little bit, by quite a bit, but Dan was like gracious enough to help us sort of optimize that. Let me try and see if I can I'm gonna share my screen real quick to see if there's any like tidbits in the code that we learned on how to do this. So basically what we're doing is, as I mentioned, like we're basically doing a pre-where function. And I think this could be optimized further, but it's basically a pre-where function. And this is only for, if you remember, so for cases where you're fetching all the links for a given workspace, only then we run this pre-where function. And this is where it gets a bit more expensive. If you're only fetching data for one single link, you basically don't need this. And it's actually quite simple. And as a result, like it's not very expensive. It's only when people are doing it for the whole workspace. And the sort of theory that we have is that not a lot of people, I mean, people obviously open this a lot, but for programmatic users like OSS Gallery, for example, you're fetching singular links. You're fetching a link for the GitHub, for the website separately. And for example, when you created a T-Bird link earlier, people would generally click on the link button here, and this is filtered under one single link. So it's not very expensive if it's not an aggregated set of data for all your links. So that's sort of like how we sort of balanced it. But yeah, there's definitely ways that improve further.
Well, yeah, and I think it's actually an important point you talk about filtering, because going back to Tinybird under the hood is using ClickHouse, which is an OLAP database. It's also uses a columnar storage format, and basically what that means is that data in columns is stored together on disk, right? So when you're accessing that data, you're accessing column data is accessed sequentially, right? It's not row based. And that becomes really important because, then basically when you add these filters, you're now saying, hey, if I'm sorting this data, and depending on how you use your sorting keys, we're like, hey, if I'm sorting this data by ID or something, that I can actually use that pre-where and minimize. Now I'm not scanning the whole table, I'm scanning just these rows. And that really minimizes,
Oops. I think you're muted. Yep, I think you're back.
I jiggled my my dock. Sorry, I'm back.
A lot of happening.
I jiggled my little docking station and it disconnected my mic. But just having that lever to basically, sort and filter really will minimize the processing compute required, and that's the cost with TinyBird. There was a question, Steven. I don't know if you're comfortable answering this, but somebody did ask, like, how much does TinyBird cost you currently? If you want to share that, that's your prerogative. If you don't want to share that, I totally understand. But
I can give you a range, right?
Okay, there you go.
We are processing upwards of a couple of terabytes of data per month. So if you do the math from like TinyBit's public pricing, you can tell like roughly how much it's costing us, and that's for 6.6 million links ingested monthly, and our total number of clicks is at about 30 plus million now. It grows so fast, I almost forgot what it is. Let's see, 31.5. So yeah, you can do the math. Like, you can sort of understand. Obviously, this is something that we're going to optimize, and I don't think it's like, you can definitely go a very long way with unoptimized queries because of how powerful, like latency, there's nothing you need to worry about.
Right.
Really, really fast. It's all about like how much you can go about like optimizing the cost. So for us, like it's not ideal yet, but I'm confident we're gonna get there. It's all about priorities and like sort of short-term, long trade-offs. We're not too conscious about cost at the moment. Obviously, it's something that needs to be optimized, but
But you're at the growth phase. You're in grow mode. Yeah,
I
get it.
That's a good problem to have, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. It's a first class problem. Cameron had a question about what is there any cost associated with the reads, and I'm happy to answer this, but yeah. So TinyBird, the public pricing is relatively simple. It's 7 cents per process gigabyte. There's also a storage cost, but process tends to be the big number in your TinyBird pricing. And by big, I mean it depends on. I think Andreas, your friend Andreas, you mentioned earlier, it's always like, oh, I'm only spending 70 cents a month on TinyBird. Should I move to something else? Like, yeah, it can be very cheap, maybe too cheap. But anyways, what does that mean? So basically, when you do a read, when you hit an API endpoint that you're hosting on TinyBird, TinyBird is going to run that query against your tables, and so it's the amount of data processed during that read, during that query will be added, will be a part of your cost. There's a powerful lever in here that we kind of touched on but didn't really dig too much into, which is materialized views. I think the simplest way to think about materialized views is like, you can basically pay to process the data once instead of every time somebody queries. So just think about a very, very simple query. It's just like a select link ID count, and you're grouping by link ID and account. Every time, if you just hit that query, if you run that query against your events data source, it's going to cost you 7 cents per gigabyte to perform that count. But using materialized views, essentially what you're doing with materialized views, you're storing aggregate states. So you can actually calculate those aggregates incrementally as data arrives into the system. And so that data gets processed once, and then you're storing aggregates, and you can query those aggregates. So that becomes a really powerful lever for people trying to improve their processing costs. Is instead of processing that data every time somebody hits the endpoint, you're going to process it once when the data gets ingested, and then when they hit the endpoint, the aggregation has already been done. And it becomes a real, like, when the materialized views thing clicks for people who have just started using TinyBird and are trying to optimize, it's like, pardon my French, it's like, oh shit, like this is a big one. It really is powerful.
Another thing I want to touch on is also setting the right indices. I think that's also important. What we did wrong in the beginning was we basically tried to include all the columns in the index. It's actually not very efficient to do that. All you need to know, I did a little bit of reading recently, is that for when you're building like a materialized view or data source, you need to be adding the first like column in the index has to be the one that you query the most, and then the second, followed by the ones that have the least number of denominations. I forgot what correct me if I'm wrong here, but basically these are like the factors you need to understand, and you shouldn't add more than 2 columns.
Right.
3, it's a little pushing it, but 2 is ideal. And you basically need to, like, for example, for us, right? We have indices for the link ID and the timestamp.
Yep.
And the reason for that is because link ID is queried a lot, like people always filter by it. And then timestamp is we do aggregations for like time series and like filter by the last 6 months, 3 months. So that's what we use. And it's really scalable because like even right now we have 30 million rows of data. If I'm retrieving time series data for one single link, I'm only processing, I just checked, 5 megabytes of data per query. So that means that if 1 gigabyte is 7 cents, this is like, I don't know, pennies, less than that.
Right.
There's
Yeah, and sorting keys, is what we call them in Tinybird. That's a really important point because kind of what I was explaining earlier, like if your primary sorting key in a data source is link ID, that means every row, every event in your table is going to be stored, basically where that link ID, they're all going to be filtered, sorted by that link ID. So same link ID sorted together on disk and then timestamped the same way. So when you do a, where timestamp between, 7 days ago and now you're filtering out such that you're only reading the data in between those timestamps, or where link ID equals, now you're filtering out, you're only reading the data where that link ID. So it's a very, really massive, that's a very important cost kind of reducer when you start to deal with analytics in a time series database or in a columnar database. All right, we're at time. We ran out of time. Yeah, no, this was great, Steven. Thanks for joining us. Those of you who are still on, again, I'll send a follow-up with the recording. If you do have questions, that follow-up is going to come from my email, so you can reply to that, and I will respond. And if you have a question for Steven, you can ask him or ping him on Twitter. Ask him on Twitter. He's very active there. But if you have questions, the other thing you could do, if you want to join the public Tinybird Slack, I'm going to show a little dub short link there. tinybird.co/Slack. If you join that, there's a lot of people on there that just if you have questions about Tinybird or about analytics in general, you have a question about your use case, what you're trying to build, and you're getting stuck, or you have a question you need answered, we're pretty active there. So that's a good place to get some questions as well. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Steven. Appreciate your time.
It was a lot of fun.
Bye, y'all.